Hello and welcome. This is a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld.org. UkraineWorld is a website in English about Ukraine, which is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the oldest and biggest Ukrainian media NGO. We continue our series about Ukrainian culture and its deep links with the European, with the global culture. This series is supported by the EU Delegation to Ukraine. And I'm very happy to have here Olesya Ostrovska, who is director of Mystetskyi Arsenal, Art Arsenal, one of the biggest and the most fantastic Ukrainian culture institutions. Good afternoon, Olesya.
Good afternoon. Happy to be with you.
Thank you so much for being with me. So we decided to talk about different aspects of Ukrainian culture to make it more understandable for the global audience, in particular through the lenses of these anti-colonial, anti-imperialist topics. But let's start with your institution. Mystetskyi Arsenal, we are now here in a wonderful building in the Kyiv downtown, but its history is remarkable because it is basically on the location of the former monastery, the Baroque monastery. Then it was the arms deposit, the weapons deposit. Therefore, it is called Arsenal. And after Ukraine's independence, it became an art institution. And it seems to us, many of us, like 10 years ago, that this transition from religion to war and then to culture and art is a natural transition from the archaic times to modernity. But now the war has come back to Ukraine for 8 years. And now with this full-scale invasion, it is there among us. How is it for you as a director of the art institution to perceive this war, to understand this war?
Well, first of all, I'm really happy to have you here in the Art Arsenal itself. Even a month ago, it was much more complicated, to say the least. And let me tell you a few words about Art Arsenal itself. Why is that a remarkable institution, I think? As you've described, it used to be the arsenal itself was built as a part of actually Russian military presence in Old Kyiv. It was a part of a Russian fortress in Kyiv downtown, which contained Russian garrison, with the aim to control the city. And it was one of the attempts of Russian westernization of Russian empire, going west. The building was built at the end of 18th century, the beginning of 19th century. It's huge. It's many thousand square meters. And it was used all the time since its foundation until approximately 2005 as a military object. So it became an art institution very recently. And as a military object, it was, again, always used as this reminder that there is a larger imperial power and imperial presence here in the very heart of Kyiv, and it was also, which is remarkable as well, it was a secret object for a very long time. Until 2005, it belonged to the Ministry of Defense, and there was no entering to this zone. As a result, it was actually very rich. It richly preserved archaeological heritage of this part of the city. So we learned a lot during excavations about Kyiv and its life for the past few centuries. But then, with Ukrainian independence, there was this illusion by the end of the 90s that wars are in the past, that imperialism is in the past, and Russia is post-imperialist. So there is no point to have large war factories in the heart of Kyiv. And it was transformed to a cultural institution, which it was actually one of the favorite projects of President Yushchenko, who himself was a very interesting figure in that period of history. And this pretty much embodies this, illusion of peace that really blossomed at that time, that wars are in the past and the future is totally different. Which we saw was very misleading later on, because as we know from Putin's writings, today's political Russia sees the war as the future. It's the imperialism, colonialism, and worship which is proposed as the new way for the world.
So basically, Russia is denying that the process of decolonization of the 20th century had a sense, had a meaning. I think we will come back to it, but one thing that strikes me about this place, let us tell to our listeners that we are just in front of the Lavra, which is one of the oldest monasteries in this part of the world, Orthodox monasteries coming from the medieval times. But why, our listeners can pose a question, why Russian Empire needed a fortress here and needed an arsenal? Because Kyiv was a frontier city. Because before the divisions of Poland, Kyiv was a city on the frontier of the Russian Empire of the 18th century. After the divisions of Poland, when all the right bank Ukraine was incorporated into the Russian Empire, Kyiv ceased to be a frontier city. It became a city of Polish culture, by the way, very interesting, then Ukrainian culture. And now when we see about Russian plans to create this Novorossiya, to divide Ukraine by half on the Dnipro, we're basically coming to this surrealistic idea of Russia to make Kyiv again a frontier city.
That's correct. I very much agree to this vision. And what's even more notorious is that, as you've said, Arsenal is in front of Kyiv-Pечерska Lavra. And at the moment when Arsenal was being built, Lavra was a very important heart of Kyiv intellectualism. So you had scholars actually creating the whole intellectual discourse, but for this part of Russian Empire, Hetmanshina, or Ukraine as we call it today, and also for St. Petersburg and Moscow, and the whole.
Even for Middle
Empire.
East, we know that Bibles who were printed here was all sent to Damascus, for example.
Right. So it was an important center to be controlled. Therefore, you needed a fortress here as well. So that's the whole complicated and complex history. And you said something very interesting, I think, about the fact that Russia denies European colonialism, or it's not a fact, I think, of European decolonization through the 20th century. I think it's a bit more complicated. Russia welcomes European decolonization through the 20th century and totally denies decolonization as applied to itself. So it would gladly support the colonial discourses on the global south, for example, instrumentalizing them pretty much for their own imperial needs, and continue be an imperial power at the same time.
That's a wonderful Russian hypocrisy, right? So to say that Russia is an empire, it is perceived globally very often as a nation state, but it is an empire. We know its history, the very history of Russian statehood became from the idea that they should take over the Byzantine Empire, symbolically. This is the idea of the Third Rome, etc. Then it was transformed into the idea of Russian Empire. But really, I think their message to the world is that, look at what you've done, the Europeans. You've done lots of bad things in your colonialism, but you were stupid enough to let these colonies go away. And we are intelligent enough not to let them go away. But at the same time, we show that we are kind of colony of the West, and we are trying to decolonize ourselves from the West and support all these former colonies of the West in this fight against the Western imperialism. Is that what they are saying?
I think it's very, very complex, and it's very hard to. There are many plot lines within this whole discourse. I have also a feeling that there is this gaze, this Russian idea that the West, the collective West, especially Western Europe. Let's stay there. Has no moral right to kind of point to Russian colonialism exactly because of West Europe's own colonial past. So that builds a kind of protection shield around Russian imperialism. And therefore, Ukrainians or Belarusians, for that matter, or Moldovans should not be listened to. Because exactly they are trying to dissolve in a way this protection shield. That's complicated, and I think it needs a lot of, I hope, for much deeper analysis in the future from the part of philosophers and theoreticians of culture, anthropologists and historians. And I guess we're at the point when we all of us as a community will have to start this work.
I have two questions in this regard. The first is to the Western intellectuals, European intellectuals, American intellectuals, who think about anti-imperialism, who think about Orientalism, who are in this line of thinking, for example, maybe of Edward Said and culture and imperialism, all this stuff. Do you think they consider Russia in these terms and think that those concepts, just concepts, fair concepts, which were applied by this scholarship towards, for example, the Western culture, European culture, as Said was applying to the French culture, British culture of the 19th century, showing how they constructed this image of the East, colonial East. Do you think they understand the Westernness, that the same concepts should be applied to Russia, as we Ukrainians say? And the second question, do Russians, are there any voices in Russia who are able and capable to do this job?
Well, I think there is more and more clear vision about Russian imperialism now. It was unimaginable some 5 years ago to speak about Russia in imperialist terms. While it is quite acceptable now. I think many things have been revealed through practice, through actual actions taken by political Russia, or by actions that were not taken by Russia, for example, by Russian intellectuals, which we will talk about a little bit later, I guess. And there is one of the reasons, I guess, is that Russian imperialism is different from Western European imperialism. So it's quite hard to recognize it. If in the Western European countries or in their experience, colonies are mostly overseas. So it's somewhere far away. While in Russian case, it's bordering nations, very close by. Close because they are close geographically, so therefore they are also close culturally. As a result, it's very hard to distinguish where those how those things happen. And also I think there is one more very complicated feature of this imperialism. It's connected to the fact that Russian imperialism, an empire, was intellectually produced in Kiev as well. And it was proposed by Kiev clerics who proposed the idea of Orthodox empire. in more or less the beginning of 18th century. And I think at that moment, when this idea was brought up, this Orthodox empire, where identity is based on the religion, was already archaic at the moment of its anticipation. And this archaic idea is being, there is this attempt to realize it, even though it's being already kind of incoherent, and irrelevant for the society, especially for Ukrainian society, which was at the same time, at the beginning of the 19th century, there was a strong national movement already taking place, connected to Cossack, Bohdan Khmelnytsky, and Cossack Wars, and all that story. So imagine how this archaic idea was developing through a few centuries, and was absolutely contra the development of the society, at least at this part of this Orthodox empire. So the fact that it was created or proposed by Kyiv intellectuals and then imposed on Ukrainians is very confusing to someone working in the field of colonial studies. It's very ambiguous. So I think it's time to start actually analyzing it, and those should be Ukrainian scholars rather, just because they have a very nuanced vision of what has been happening.
That's a fantastic topic. I like it very much. I think it's understudied in Ukraine as well, because we are kind of shy enough to say that many things that happened in Russia were influenced by Ukrainians, including those things from which Ukrainians suffered afterwards. So you mentioned these Kyiv intellectuals of the early 18th century. You mean Theophan Prokopovich, Stefan Yavorskin, and others. My hypothesis is that Theophan Prokopovich, he studied in Rome, then he studied in Halle in Germany. He was accepting the Protestant ideas of the supremacy of a monarch over religion. He brought this idea to Russia because he thought that it is the best thing to kind of modernize society, to get rid of some archaic religious influences. What we had in as a result, Russia, which destroys the autonomy of the church, in which the church is absolutely subjugated to the Tsar, and which produces even more authoritarian state. So the idea that seek more freedom produced more authoritarian state. The same we can say about 19th century, when Ukrainian intellectuals and Polish intellectuals were bringing to Russia this idea of people, folk, narod, etc., which was used by Russian authoritarianism to kind of build this far-right Russian nationalism, which are now we are suffering from. Do you agree with these twists?
I very much agree with 19th century, but speaking about Prokopovich, I rather see it in terms of corporate conflict, where you had, at the time, a period of Prokopovich, you had a few social forces. Those were aristocracy, then clerics, then Cossacks. Aristocracy, I mean the old Ruthenian coming from the Kievan Rus time. And they had different interests. Something which was in the interest of Orthodox clergy was not necessarily in the interest of Cossack upper class. And Prokopovich, in my feeling or view, was proposing an idea of Orthodox empire which would strengthen also the corporation of Orthodox clergy, in contrast to Catholic clergy, which was very strong in Kyiv at that time. So there was this aspect of corporate tension as well, which formed or paved the way for what came next. However, I have to confess that I'm not a historian, so these are basically thoughts and ideas connected to the place where we are. Because Art Arsenal is exactly about what has been happening with Kiev, the idea of Kiev, with Kiev clergy, with this part of the city, and how it influenced the whole situation. You said it was a part of the monastery first, then it became Russian fortress, then it became Ukrainian cultural site. And this cultural site, our mission is pretty much to analyze, to reflect upon the past, because we are also a museum, so we keep a collection, and our collection is composed of three parts. One is contemporary art. The other one is avant-garde art of 20th century, and then there is also objects which we acquired by way of excavations of this part of the city. So it's historical, archaeological objects telling the story. And that forms pretty much the way our programs are developed and the type of institution we are.
Coming to this question, it's a very interesting question how you combine this archaeology, archaic things, and then avant-garde, and then contemporary art. Do you think there are some leitmotifs of Ukrainian art, some topics that are repeating and coming back? Because for me, one of the leitmotifs is that there is no conflict between tradition and modernity. There is an attempt to always to bring tradition and modernity together. If we look at Ukrainian avant-garde of early 20th century, we can find this. If we look at some Ukrainian contemporary painters, for example, I look how Alexander Roydbort, one of the prominent Ukrainian painters, unfortunately, who passed away some time ago, how he plays with these traditional topics, the Jewish traditional topics, Ukrainian traditional topics. Do you have this impression?
I wouldn't say so. I don't have this exactly impression about Ukrainian culture. I think it was, if you look at 20th century, at the 20s, and 20s of 20th century are an extremely important period for Ukrainian culture. Actually, our period now is the only period of Ukrainian culture in 100 years that can be paired to the 20s of the 20th century. So, of course, there were many artworks that would somehow reflect or drive on ethnic motifs, and you had avant-garde artists working with the whole factories producing, for example, embroidery. So they were embroidering avant-garde pictures, doing something very modern through traditional means. But on the other hand, I wouldn't say that it was subjugated to this, ethnic cultural vision. Rather, it was more like using it to somehow enrich because Ukrainian culture of the beginning of 20th century was a natural part of European landscape. There were many interconnections. Artists studied abroad often. There were also many interconnections with the Russian art scene, and it wasn't. This somehow isolationist type of working with art. It was rather using tradition also as a certain means, artistic means.
But that's precisely what I'm thinking, because in Europe, we often see, I think after the Second World War especially, we see the trend to this idea of revolution, aesthetic revolution. everybody was trying to make some revolution in abstract art, in some other things. So it was kind of a juxtaposition of modernity versus tradition. Whereas in Ukrainian tradition, in literature especially, maybe in visual arts, if we look at the 20s, if we think about Malevich, if we think about Narbut, Bohomazov, and others, we see this statement that no, there is no contradiction between deep past and in the future and the present.
Well, I'm not sure about this.
Okay.
I think this speculation goes a little bit too deep.
Okay, but I will try to go deep in this speculation a little bit later, because I really cherish this idea. I think it's one of the peculiarities of the Ukrainian culture, and we see it right now also in music, how Ukrainian musicians are using the ethno motifs, etc.
I would agree with the music and with the contemporary music. This is something which, to me, resembles the history of blues, where you had something very peculiar transformed into modern forms in music. But why is that? So present on Ukrainian music scene? I'm not sure at the moment. Maybe it's connected to the need to be distinctive. Especially, on the to be distinctive as a kind of post-Soviet experience where everything had to be homonized. We are, of course, we inherited the social realist type of attitude towards any creativity, where things had to be homonized in a way. Being the need to be distinctive is connected to this extensive usage of ethnic music. It was not like that at the beginning of 20th century. The experience was different at that time. And if you look at what was really capturing imagination of artists at that time, that was futurism was one of the most important artistic movements on Ukrainian cultural scene. And it was the city, the velocity, which was important, being fast, being industrialized, being machine-like. That was something that really captured imagination at that time. There was one phenomenon which really worked with the archaic forms, and that was the circle of Mikhailo Boychuk, and they were developing this program of painting, which is related to medieval and Renaissance practices. They were using the same type of paints. They were painting in certain way. They were basically working with very large forms, with frescoes. But there is still a debate among Ukrainian scholars whether Boychukism and Boychuk circle was an avant-garde movement or not.
But, I mean, you can really pose the question whether avant-garde, even European avant-garde, was all about future. Because you can pose the question about, the archaic elements of pre-avant-garde painting, like Modigliani or Gauguin, etc., and how they were trying to go to the archaic forms, and how Ukrainian avant-garde, with Malevich, also were trying to go to the archaic forms and take these forms of futurism and then build and make a picture of Ukrainian peasants. Well, that's an interesting discussion, but let me come back to the contemporary art. If you look at Ukrainian contemporary art and culture, would you agree that in the past decades it was increasingly globalized and Europeanized and trying to find its entry into the European and global scene?
Yes, I think so. There were a bit different processes. If you take, for example, literature and contemporary art, there were different centers of this entrance into global world. Because Kiev and Ukraine generally was seen as periphery for a very long time, for the reasons that we discussed earlier. So artists and writers were seeking for alternative centers to enter the global scene, and there were different trajectories. Artists chose Moscow for a long time until the mid of 2000s. Writers always chose Poland. And the reason was very simple, choice of language. In literature, you have to choose the language because this is your material. This is something you work with. And if you choose Ukrainian language, Moscow is no-go. There is a very different... there is a different scene, basically. Artists didn't have to choose the language. Therefore, they could connect to Russian scene for a much longer time. One of the most important Ukrainian artistic phenomena of the end of 1980s, the beginning of 19th, had double title, which is very telling, I guess. In Ukraine, we called it a new Ukrainian wave. In Russia, they called it Southern Russian wave, which I think reflects the...
That's 19th century, this...
very imperial.
Yeah.
And we are talking about contemporary
Rus,
art.
that's how Ukraine was called in the 19th century imperial literature, even by Ukrainians themselves. Even Ukrainian writers were writing about Yuzhная Rus, not about Ukraine, the Southern Rus.
In accordance with that, I guess, the phenomenon was called Южно-Русская волна, Southern Russian wave, which is very interesting if you look at the very essence of the artistic phenomenon, because this is contemporary art, and contemporary art is supposed to be critical, self-critical, and self-reflective. And there you have a huge imperial blind spot, right, on it. And it was like that until the Orange Revolution, definitely. There was a change of generation in a way, if you can speak in generational terms. Connected to Orange Revolution, and the next wave of artists was much more left-leaning, much more less. They were working less with paintings, more with abstract forms such as performance, for example. And while the previous wave of art was connected to paintings mostly, and those were very paintings that were very rich in colors and textures. Therefore, for Russian critics, they were associated with sun and fruit and summer. And therefore this name. Well, the next generation was very cold, very conceptual, and very socially oriented, and much more understandable for the international scene, because it corresponded with the at least West European artistic scene. And artists of that generation became quite a natural part of the art scene, at least in Eastern Europe for sure, and also in Germany, Austria, and countries like that. That was more or less the case until the Revolution of Dignity, 2014. Funny enough, all those waves, at least as I described them now, are somehow connected to our revolutionary movements. And after the Revolution of Dignity and the Russian invasion of 2014, you don't have such a coherent artistic phenomena or a clear cohort of artists working on the same platform, more or less. There is the much wider the circle of phenomena, I guess, is much wider, or maybe we are still in the middle of it and we cannot describe it yet.
If you look at contemporary Ukrainian art and culture, do you see some maybe embryonic trends, or maybe they have developed trends? How Ukrainian culture can really enrich the European and global cultures? What are the phenomenon, topics, approaches which are really maybe trend-setting?
Well, I think, honestly, I don't think this question is even needs an answer. Of course, every culture is enriching the international phenomena, international scene, because it gives you a different gaze, a different perspective on things. Ukrainian cultural scene is interesting, is really blossoming. That's why I said that this is the first time since the 20s of the 20th century when Ukrainian culture is really well developed. But I think we should also mention why it's the case. And the case is that almost entire Ukrainian art scene of the 20s was demolished. People were simply physically executed. Of, let's say, 250 writers, to more than 200 were physically executed. And artists were executed, artworks were often destroyed physically, again, or hidden. Some artworks, we still have them because they were hidden by some people. And this experience of loss is a very important cultural experience of Ukrainians, because there was a huge loss of the 30s where you lose the whole scene and artworks. Then there was World War II, and there was the period when Ukrainian culture lost museum collections as well, because they were evacuated. Some of them were evacuated, let's say, to Russia and never returned. Some were captured by Germans. Something was returned. So there was a lot of museum object loss. Then, after World War II, you had social realism tightly imposed, which was really control mean for any creativity, and artists could not really create freely. So it was a softer loss, but it's a loss again. And this sense of loss is probably one of the most distinctive of Ukrainian cultural experience of the past 100 years. And it was the primary experience all the way up to now, up to 1991. And after 1991, there was suddenly very modest and then more and more broad this feeling of building again, and until now, the past few years were probably the most fruitful on Ukrainian cultural scene, and now Russian invasion, this full-scale invasion that we are living through right now, actually returns us to the old pattern of loss. And it's extremely hard for Ukrainian creators to reflect that and to not to fall into the same old trap of loss.
I think this is a fantastic observation, And this leads myself to another abstract observation, which you probably disagree with, and truly so, rightly so. Western European culture, I think it was so much obsessed with this accumulation of artworks that suddenly we can explain Western avant-garde as a wish to reject it, right? To reject this accumulation of culture. And the culture was building in the early 20th century as a kind of rejection of culture, this very paradoxical way. In Ukraine, this feeling of loss is something very different. So this explains why we have this ethnic revival, because people are thirsty for this, right? So people really want to dig deep into their roots. And this creates absolutely different attitude to the past, I think, in a way that the past is seen as a chance for the future and not as an objection to the future. But let me now, we are approaching the finish of our conversation, ask you about this experience, because the war experience, because we see Russians really targeting museums, and that's absolutely horrible. We have seen the museum of Maria Primachenko destroyed, one of the fantastic, I would say, archetypical Ukrainian painters who really gave us so many these primitive art forms or initial or original art forms. Several days ago, we have seen the destruction of the Museum of Grigory Skovoroda, which is our fantastic Baroque philosopher in Kharkiv Oblast. So, are we again in this sentiment of the loss? And maybe this will be one of the topics of Ukrainian culture in the decades to follow, not only of the loss of art, of course, but primarily of loss of lives, loss of hopes, loss of future.
I think what's important now, what might be different, is that we are free to reflect on that. During the 20th century in Soviet time, it was not only the loss, it was also prohibition to reflect on its loss, which deepened the situation. We are in the situation when we can reflect, and this is exactly what we are doing right now, you and me. This is exactly what Arsenal is doing. No matter what, our team is continuing its work. We are working both internationally. We also start working now, or we hope to be able to start working now for Kyiv audience. Because let me make a small digression. Since the Russian invasion in February 2022, a mission of every cultural institution of Ukraine changed a little bit, and it's very uniform through the whole range of institutions. There are two things that institutions are doing. It's preserving tangible and intangible. And the second one is getting Ukrainian voice out on the international scene. And this is what we've been doing as an institution as well, these two things. But now, for the past few weeks, as Kyiv is slowly getting back to life, which is very fragile and can change at any second at all to previous condition, but as Kyiv is slowly, in a very fragile fashion, coming back to life, we understand that we have to be, let me be a bit melodramatic, that we have to be with our people in Kyiv, offering them some cultural experience, which might not be so such a complicated, nuanced, intellectual experience, but rather experience of being together, experience of hope a little bit, experience of warmth and safety as much as it's possible under these circumstances. So it's our third goal in a way. And I think it's the same for many institutions in many cities. That when it comes to your question, whether we will get into this mode of losing again, I think the antidote for that is exactly the work of cultural institutions right now, even under given circumstances.
Thank you. Thank you. This is very important, and thank you for all your work. We had Olesya Ostrovska, the director of Kyiv Mystetskyi Arsenal, Art Arsenal, wonderful Ukrainian intellectual and art manager. This was Explaining Ukraine podcast. Let me remind you that this is a series about Ukrainian culture and its links with the global and European culture. This series is brought to you by Internews Ukraine with support of EU Delegation to Ukraine. You can also support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm chief editor of UkraineWorld.org. Stay with us and stay with us.